Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 5, and in this we're going to look at the struggle for civil rights. And so Chapter 5 focuses on an overview of the major civil rights movements, court decisions, and legislation. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the fight for racial and gender equality, but make sure you read the full chapter in order to get a more complete picture of civil rights. So let's go ahead and get started. So, as it says at the top there, that civil rights are positives. In other words, civil rights are these positive activities that government take in order to make sure that the full rights of citizenship are endowed and ensured by the people that live in that country. And so civil rights is really about the question of, like, who is a citizen? And if you're considered a citizen, are you given the full political and civil rights that is fundamental to living in a democratic society? So if you are a citizen and you are denied political and civil rights, then that it's really difficult to consider that country a democracy. Civil rights is about defining who can participate in the political process and in civil society. So civil rights is about the political rights of citizenship, right? The right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to serve on a jury. I know a lot of us are like, jury duty, who wants to do it? But juries are really important because it's where the people are the ones who make the final determination in terms of somebody's guilt or innocence. Civil rights is also about making sure that when people apply for a job, when people want to spend a night in a hotel, when a person wants to get married, when a person wants to buy a home or rent an apartment, that they aren't discriminated against, right? And so that civil rights is about how people are treated when it comes to employment, when it comes to education, when it comes to housing, and when it comes to marriage, and making sure that people are not discriminated against in those endeavors. So earlier in the semester, we said just because you call yourself a democracy doesn't make yourself a democracy. Well, the same is true about civil rights, that you can call yourself a democracy, but if that country does not provide robust protections of political and civil rights, it's really hard to call yourself a democracy. Why? Well, because democracy is rule of the people, and you can't have rule of the people if the vast portions of people are denied fundamental rights, if they're denied the right to vote, if they're discriminated when they're trying to get a job, right? So you can't call yourself a democracy if you don't have robust protections for civil rights. In the United States, ensuring civil rights is a product of a centuries-long struggles for these rights. As I said at the end of the last lecture, that civil rights doesn't happen magically. Applying the Equal Protection Clause isn't a magical endeavor. Making sure that the Equal Protection Clause is applied and protects people from discrimination is a product of people being discriminated against and then saying that they've been harmed by that discriminatory treatment and asking the government to do something about it. And that's why civil rights are positive, because we are demanding government to make sure that people are treated equally. Many groups of people have been denied civil rights throughout the history of the United States. And that's particularly true for African Americans. As the textbook points out, they have a great quote that says, for African Americans, the central fact of political life for most of American history has been a denial of full citizenship rights. That begins with Africans through the slave trade coming to the United States and not even being considered people, but being considered property through the chattel slave system. Chattel slavery is, a system where humans are regarded as property, and that legal property, they can be bought, they can be sold, they can be owned forever. That families can be torn apart because it's you're not treated as a human, but you're treated as property. And even when slavehold chattel comes to an end, so it starts in 1619 and it ends in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment, that the denial of full citizenship rights continues. As Reconstruction fails, states pass, particularly southern states, pass what are known as black codes. Black codes are, a direct restriction of the rights of African Americans. It's codes saying that African Americans can't conduct business, that they can't own property, that they can't buy or lease land, right? So it's a legal extension of that denial of rights. And that continues after Plessy versus Ferguson, when the courts say separate but is equal, into a system of legal racial apartheid, basically legal separation of the races, which is known as Jim Crow laws. And so when you sort of think about the African American experience in the United States, 1619 through, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that's about 350 years of a denial of those rights. And that getting those rights and expanding those rights, is a struggle that takes place for over 200 years and continues today. Since the 17th century, very few women have had a recognized legal identity. And so when we think about racial inequality, we also had gender inequality too from the colonial era. And so, women were really considered to be outside of legal rights. As it says there, from the, women as daughters were under the legal guardianship of their fathers. And so they didn't have any legal rights like most children have. But for women, that they would stay under the legal guardianship of their fathers until they were married. And at the point of marriage, that their legal guardianship would shift from their father to their husband. And that was known as the legal system of what was known as coverture. That when women got married, all of their legal rights were subsumed underneath their husband's legal rights. And so basically they lost any legal identity. Now you could say, well, then don't get married. But the vast majority of women were married at that time, in large part due to discriminatory practices and also discriminatory social practices as well. It was very difficult for women to get employment outside of the home, and there was social pressure and social normalization that was the proper place for women. And so when women would get married, that they could not own property, that they couldn't make a contract. They couldn't, even if they had a job, that their wage was not legally theirs, that they would have to give that to the person who had the legal identity, their husband. And if they were divorced, even though divorce was rare, that they didn't have legal guardianship of their children because they didn't have a legal identity. On top of that, that there were political rights that were denied as well. So it wasn't until the passage of the 19th Amendment that women had a legal right to vote. They didn't have a legal right to hold office in many states. And like African Americans, they didn't have a legal right to serve on juries. And so, these denial of civil rights continue into the 1960s and 70s, and so legal discrimination is allowed in employment and education. In other words, it was legal. You could discriminate on the basis of sex when somebody applied to a job. You could also discriminate on the basis of education applying to a school until the passage of Title IX in 1972. So yes, the history of the United States is a history of the denial of civil rights to many groups within the United States. But the history of the United States is also a history of the fight for attaining and expanding civil rights. These go hand in hand. Rights are denied and people fight for their rights. And so let's turn our sights now to these struggles that resulted in an effort to create a more perfect union. The fight against slavery has been going on since the colonial era, But it really doesn't gain traction until the 1930s, where there's a rising abolitionist movement in the United States. And that culminates with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the development of the Republican Party, which is an anti-slavery party, and then ultimately results in the Civil War. Following the Civil War, we have obviously the inclusion of the Civil War amendments that helps with the efforts for attaining civil rights for African Americans. And there's also a passage of the Civil Rights Acts from the 1860s that also expand the political and social rights of African Americans. And as your textbook points out, we see a rise in African Americans voting and getting elected to office. Following the Civil War, there are 14 African Americans who are members of Congress. But unfortunately, that effort at expanding the civil rights of African Americans is short-lived. The era following the Civil War, where there's this effort to reconstruct the South and to expand civil rights for African Americans, that fails quite quickly. Your textbook talks about the Compromise of 1877, where the Republican Congress agrees that, let Rutherford B. Hayes be the president, and in exchange, we're going to let the South return to its sort of pre-Reconstruction ways. In other words, that these efforts to expand the civil rights of African Americans in the South, the Republican Party gives up on them. And so, basically it is a time period where we see a return to legalized segregation in the United States. Make sure in your textbook you read about the important case, Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a case that's challenging the separate but equal train cars in the state of Louisiana, and the landmark decision that establishes the separate but equal rule that's in force until 1964 in the United States. I like to highlight that when it comes to the fight for civil rights, that we have an overlapping between those who are fighting for the civil rights of African Americans, the abolitionist movement, and also people who are fighting for the civil rights of women as well. And so that there is, a long history of the fight for abolition. You see there the abolitionist Wendell Phillips, who in 1850 was fighting against the Fugitive Slave Act that basically, says that when a slave, goes to a free state to seek freedom, that they're still property and they can be brought back, back into slavery. You have Harriet Tubman, which I'm sure most of you know. I love that picture. Harriet Tubman we don't know exactly when she was born, but she was born into slavery in the 1820s in Maryland. But she lives almost, to very, almost 100 years. So that's a picture of Harriet Tubman in 1911, and that she spent her later years living in New York, and I just love that picture of her. Harriet Tubman, as you know, the inspiration behind the Underground Railroad, which was the effort to transport people who are running from slavery into the free states. But she was also, she was an abolitionist, obviously, but she was also a suffragette, and she fought hard for the rights for women to vote. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton there in the corner. Let me put my magic pen on. This is another example of that intersection. In the textbook, you'll read about the fight for women's rights, the right to vote, and the Seneca Falls Conference, which was basically the first women's conference in the United States that was attended by both men and women in 1848, demanding that women be basically given equal treatment. And they write the Declaration of Sentiments that's based on the Declaration of Independence. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist, but she was also a person who fought for the rights of women. And that this culminates in part with the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So following the decision Plessy, racial discrimination is made legal throughout much of the United States. And it really shows you the power of the Supreme Court in terms of question comes to the Supreme Court, are these separate but equal, supposedly equal train cars, do they violate the Equal Protection Clause? And they say no, that it doesn't violate the Equal Protection Clause. And that results in an over, 60, 70 years of this legal racial discrimination. These were known as Jim Crow laws. It was basically a legal system of mandated racial segregation of daily life. And so, as we know, separate schools, but also separate hotels, separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, etc. Right? And the Supreme Court decision in Plessy does not go without being challenged. There's an outcry in the United States, and because of that decision. And, starting in the early part of the 20th century, there is a political and legal mobilizations to challenge racial segregation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, is established in 1909. The reason that they're established is in large part to challenge Jim Crow laws and to pursue litigation against racially discriminatory laws. It's the United States' entry into World War II in the 1940s that really begins to draw attention to American hypocrisy on civil rights. On the one hand, the United States is involved in a war that is defending democracy in Europe, basically making a case for how dangerous fascism is and promoting democratic values. We do that abroad, but we fall short at home. So you have African American men who are fighting in World War II, fighting for democracy, but they get home and they still don't have voting rights, and they can still be legally discriminated against in employment and in housing. And same with women, right? Women fought in World War II, or didn't fight in World War II, but provided support systems in World War II. But at home, they were in the factories, keeping the wartime economy vibrant. And then when men came back from war, women would lose their jobs, okay? So it's really the World War II that becomes this sort of turning point in terms of the United States' approach to civil rights and this pressure to expand them. One of these moments of expanding civil rights comes from a shift in the court's application of the Equal Protection Clause. So remember, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Equal Protection Clause is not violated because while you're separated, you still have equal facilities. The Supreme Court changes their thinking on that in the 1940s. And it's at that point where Jim Crow begins to meet its demise. And that starts in the 1940s and it continues into the 1950s. Make sure you read about the case Shelley versus Kramer in a case from 1948. Your textbook says that this is probably one of the most important civil rights cases in terms of the history of the expansion of civil rights. This is a case where the Supreme Court finds these things called restrictive covenants as to be unconstitutional. Restrictive covenants are these legal documents that are placed when you buy a house. And it basically says that when you buy a house, you agree that, so a white person buys a house or a Christian buys a house, and a part of the covenant agreement about in the mortgage, in the legal document of ownership, says that when you sell this house, you will not sell it to somebody who's not white and who's not Christian. Well, those restrictive covenants come to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says those clearly violate the Equal Protection Clause. And then, of course, with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the court strikes down the precedent of Plessy and finds that racial discrimination in educational facilities is unconstitutional, and it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Following the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, there's social mobilization in the United States to expand civil rights protections into federal law. It's one thing to have a Supreme Court decision saying that racial segregation and racial discrimination is unconstitutional. It's another thing to put it and codify that in federal law. And that's what starts taking place in the 1950s and the 60s with the passage of several civil rights laws, starting with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you'll read in much more detail about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in your textbook, but it does several things. One of the things that it does is that it prevents segregation on the grounds of race, religion, and national origin. And so it prohibits segregation in public accommodations like hotels, restaurants, theaters, okay? You can no longer say, hey, you can't eat at this lunch counter, eat at another lunch counter, black people, or you can't stay at this hotel. So it ends racial and ethnic discrimination in public accommodations. It also ends discrimination when it comes to employment, not just on the grounds of race and ethnicity, but also on the grounds of sex. And so the Civil Rights Act prohibits sexual and racial discrimination in employment practices. And also it codifies educational segregation, basically saying that educational facilities cannot be segregated on the basis of race, but it didn't include sex, only race. So the Civil Rights Act, it's a comprehensive act. You'll read more about it in the textbook. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and the Voting Rights Act was an effort to pass federal law to make sure that Southern states in particular were not using racially discriminatory practices when it comes to voting. The Housing Rights Act of 1968 expands civil rights into housing, basically saying that you cannot discriminate when it comes to housing on the basis of race. Title IX, since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not prohibit sexual discrimination in educational facilities on the basis of sex, that there was a movement in the United States among feminists and women activists who basically said, no, you can't have discrimination in educational facilities on the basis of sex. And so they passed Title IX in 1972. And then the 24th Amendment was added to the United States Constitution. And this is an amendment that prohibits the use of poll taxes in voting. The passage of these laws would not have taken place had it not been for action on the ground, direct action. And this is a variety of pictures that are showing individuals and groups engaged in social action and social movements as it relates to the expansion of civil rights. So up here in the corner is a group of individuals. Woolworths, that was like a store you could go to, and they had lunch counters. You could eat lunch there, and the lunch counters were for whites only. And so one of the direct actions that students and others took action was that they would have groups of white and black people go and sit at the lunch counters in order to violate the whites only lunch counter laws. And then you can see here the kind of treatment that they were subject to, people pouring ketchup and Coke and sugar on their heads. They violated these laws. They were arrested for violating those laws, but they did that because they wanted to draw attention to the inhumanity and the discriminatory practices of those whites only laws. Here is a picture of John Lewis in Selma, Alabama in 1965. This was a march after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Voting rights were still not secured. And so John Lewis and others were at the forefront of marching in order to assure that there were going to be civil rights as it relates to voting rights. And this is the historic march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where the folks who are marching for the voting rights were brutally beaten down by cops that were basically preventing that march from continuing. Here you have women, the National Organization of Women, who are fighting for equal treatment in education and also encouraging the inclusion of the word sex in the Civil Rights Act as it relates to employment discrimination. And here is a picture from the Stonewall protests that took place in the 1960s. These protests were protests for gay, lesbian, transgender folks who were basically challenging discriminatory laws that relate to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Sorry about my dogs. And the fight for civil rights continues to this day. Here's just a series of pictures of some of the movements in the United States as it relates to expanding civil rights. And so in the corner here is a picture from the Black Lives Matter rallies that took place. That's in Milwaukee, that drew attention and continues to draw attention to racial discriminatory practices of law enforcement. You're going to be reading an article this week and having a debate about that very issue and other issues regarding the long legacy of racial discrimination in the United States. There was the Me Too movement several years ago that drawed attention to to sexual harassment and sexual assault that was taking place inside corporate America and in the entertainment industry and beyond, that even though we have laws on the books that prohibit that kind of discriminatory treatment, the Civil Rights Act prevents that, so does Title IX, prevents discriminatory treatment of women and men as it relates to sexual harassment and sexual assault. It's not always enforced. And so the Me Too movement drew attention to that. This is a picture of DACA and Dreamers, people who are brought here illegally by their families as children, and that there's a fight for citizenship recognition. And here it's the fight for marriage equality. In Obergefell v. Hodges, that Supreme Court case said that there is a constitutional right to marry who you want to marry. Although given the decision in Roe v. Wade, some wonder just how solid that decision in Obergefell is. So the struggle for civil rights continues and will continue on into the future. So there's a lot to cover in this chapter, and I hope the lecture wasn't too wandering about. But I try to highlight some of the most important aspects of the fight for gender and racial equality. But make sure that you read the textbook as well. So just in conclusion, civil rights is this interaction of social movements, changing attitudes, court rulings, and federal and state law. And when all of those come together, we really can see that there can be a long-term expansion of civil rights, equal treatment, and reducing discriminatory practices within the United States. Thanks a lot for paying attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.